Hello there, and welcome to Echoes of the Imperium. I'm truly glad you've arrived. Maybe it's been a long day, or maybe you're the kind of soul who prefers to drift into sleep with thoughts of distant stars and ancient cosmic secrets instead of counting sheep. Either way, tonight's journey belongs to you. You don't need to do anything now, just rest. Let your mind grow quiet, your breath steady, and your body feel lighter, as if even the pull of gravity has begun to fade away.
The sky over Helia X did not explode or burn or scream the way warp storms do. Instead, it opened, slowly and silently, like an old wound being remembered. And in those first 40 seconds before anyone understood what they were seeing, the Auspex arrays returned nothing but errors and prayer codes. The void shields hummed in confusion, and the Imperial Guard patrols froze with rifles, half-raised as a single figure descended through the cloud cover without thrusters, without wings, without fire, just a man, falling gently as if gravity itself had been persuaded to let go. I was there, quill in hand, lungs full of recycled air and incense, tasked only with recording orbital debris from a recent skirmish. When the clouds parted and light followed him down, real light, clean and white, not the corpse glow of Promethium or the sickly lumens of Manufactorum towers. And my first instinct was not awe but dread, because nothing in the Imperium arrives quietly unless it is already too late. He landed in the ash flats beyond Hive Callist, boots touching ground with the softness of snowfall, and for a moment the wind stopped. The omnipresent howl of distant artillery faded, and even the Vox traffic stuttered as if the planet itself was listening. He stood there tall, broad-shouldered, draped in colors so vibrant they felt obscene against the grays and rusts of our world, a symbol emblazoned on his chest that meant nothing to any catechism. I knew, and he looked around, not with hunger or contempt, but with confusion edged by sorrow. The guardsmen nearest him barked orders out of reflex, hands shaking on lasgun triggers, and when one of them tripped in the loose ash, the stranger moved faster than thought, catching the man before he fell, setting him upright with a gentleness that broke something inside me, because no one in the Imperium is gentle without reason, and kindness without expectation is indistinguishable from witchcraft. He spoke then, voice calm, carrying without amplification, asking where he was, asking what had happened to this world. And the sound of it was wrong in a way I cannot fully articulate, steady, hopeful, unafraid. The Commissar recovered first, of course, shouting accusations of Xenos infiltration, psychic assault, heretical mutation, and ordered the firing line raised. And I remember screaming without realizing I had opened my mouth, because some instinct older than doctrine told me that if we fired, something irreparable would be lost. The volley never came. The stranger simply raised his hands, palms open, and the lasgun power packs overheated in unison, coils glowing red-hot as if embarrassed by their own intent, weapons clattering uselessly to the ground while the men stared in horror and reverence. He did not smile. That is important. There was no triumph in his face, no satisfaction, only a tightening around the eyes as he took in the Gothic spires, the skull-marked banners, the endless devotional chains hanging from hablocks like the ribs of a starved god. "This isn't right," he murmured, more to himself than to us. And the words cut deeper than any accusation, because the Imperium survives on the assertion that everything is exactly as it must be. Within minutes, Arbit's transports screamed overhead, inquisitorial seals were invoked, and sanctified restraints were brought forth, chains etched with hexagrammic wards meant to bind demons and psychers alike. He did not resist as they were placed on his wrists. Indeed, he studied them with quiet curiosity, as though trying to understand why a civilization would greet the unknown with such practiced fear. As they marched him toward the bastion, I walked behind, my duty to observe warring with a growing treasonous urge to speak to him, to ask him what it was like to come from a place where the sky did not always burn. Inside the bastion, beneath vaults carved with 1,000 years of suspicion, they stripped him of his garments, tested his flesh with blades and toxins, and found nothing that behaved as it should. Skin that resisted atom, cells that drank radiation like sunlight, a heartbeat slow and steady even under psychic assault. The sanctioned psyker assigned to probe his mind collapsed screaming, blood streaming from her eyes, babbling about too much light. And that was when the fear shifted, became something colder, not a demon, they whispered, not warp-born, not touched by the ruinous powers, something else, something clean. That word passed through the chamber like a curse. I was ordered to record everything, every test, every reaction, but my notes grew erratic as I watched him endure humiliation and suspicion without anger, asking again and again why humanity had chained itself so completely to suffering. When an interrogator screamed that suffering was sacred, that it was the price of survival, The stranger bowed his head, and for the first time I felt the weight of his presence fully, a gravity not of mass but of conviction. On my world, he said softly, we believed strength was meant to protect, not rule. Silence followed, thick and suffocating, because those words had no place here, and yet they echoed in my skull long after the chains were locked and the order was given to transfer him off-world for further study. As the bastion's gates sealed behind him, I realized with a clarity that frightened me more than any warp entity ever had, if this man truly believed what he said, if he truly embodied it, then the greatest danger he posed to the Imperium was not conquest or destruction but hope, the kind that makes people ask why the galaxy must be this way at all. They moved him aboard the black ship Pax Veritas under layers of secrecy so dense even the void seemed sworn to silence, and for the first minute after translation into the warplo's 40 to 60 seconds, when reality usually screams, when crewmen pray through clenched teeth and blood seeps from nostrils, I watched him closely, waiting for the inevitable revelation of demonic truth, because nothing untainted passes through the Imperium unchanged. Yet he merely steadied himself as the Gellerfield flared, eyes narrowing not in pain but in concentration, like a man bracing against a storm he could not see. And when the ship screamed around us, metal warping under unreality, he closed his eyes and whispered something that did not sound like a prayer. The warp noticed him. I know this because the whispers changed. I have catalogued warp phenomena for 3 decades, survived 4 translations without sedation, and learned to distinguish madness from intrusion. And the moment we entered the Empyrean, the usual chorus of hunger and mockery recoiled, curdling into confusion, then into something dangerously close to rage. The lights flickered, server skulls jittered midair, and one by one the astropaths along the central choir began screaming not the ecstatic agony of warp vision, but raw terror, as if something impossibly bright had turned to look at them from within the void. He felt it too. I saw his jaw tighten, his hands curl slightly, not against the restraints but against the sensation of being watched by an infinity that despised him for existing. This place is wrong, he said quietly, and I wanted to laugh hysterically at the understatement of it, at the idea of explaining the warp, the seething afterbirth of emotion and damnation to someone who had never needed gods to survive. The first incursion came without warning, a ripple through the Gellerfield like oil on water, a pressure drop that made my ears bleed, and then things began to crawl out of the walls. Forms that had no right angles, faces made of mouths, laughter stitched together from stolen memories. The armsman opened fire, lasbolts illuminating the corridor in strobing hell, and the stranger Superman, the interrogators had named him mockingly, as if titles could cage truth, stepped forward despite his chains, placing himself between the crew and the oncoming horror with an instinctive certainty that chilled me. He did not strike at first. He watched, eyes glowing faintly now, not red but white-hot, like a forge pushed past tolerance. And when the first demon lunged, he caught it midair, fingers closing around unreality itself, and tore it apart not with rage but with grim necessity, as one might put down a rabid animal. There was no holy chant, no invocation of the Emperor's name, no warp backlash, just raw, impossible strength applied with surgical restraint, and the demons howled not in pain but in outrage, because something was killing them that did not belong to the great game. More came, clawing through bulkheads, whispering promises of dominion, of worship, of becoming what the Imperium secretly yearned for, a god who cared. And I saw his expression harden as realization dawned. This galaxy did not merely suffer, it fed on suffering, and its predators wore divinity like a mask. He fought then, not like an Astartes roaring catechisms, not like a custodian executing perfection, but like a guardian desperately holding a collapsing door. Every movement calculated to minimize collateral damage. Every blow measured, even as the warp bent around him in protest. At one point the Gellerfield collapsed entirely for 3 heartbeats, 3 eternal seconds, and I felt my soul clawing at my ribcage to escape. Yet around him there was a bubble of stillness, a pocket of reality so stable it hurt to look at, and within it the demons hesitated, shrank, some even fled, shrieking about the sunborn lie and hope that burns. When the field reasserted and the corridor fell silent except for sobbing crew, he stood amid dissolving ichor chains still hanging from his wrists like broken promises, breathing hard not from exertion but from restraint. This universe needs help, he said, voice low, almost breaking. And for the first time I saw doubt in him, not doubt in his strength, but in the scale of what he faced. The aftermath was worse than the battle. Inquisitor Halbricht arrived, face pale beneath his augmetic eye, and ordered immediate escalation, declaring the subject an existential threat capable of destabilizing the warp itself, a living anomaly that could provoke chaos into unprecedented unity. As Medicaid tended to the wounded, I watched Halbrecht look at Superman not with fear but calculation, the look of a man deciding whether to burn a planet to save a doctrine, and I understood then that if chaos did not destroy this being, the Imperium would try. Later, alone in my quarters, hands still shaking as I transcribed the events, I realized something that chilled me deeper than the warp ever had. For the first time in recorded history, the demons had not been lying when they screamed, because hope, in a galaxy built on despair, is not a virtue, it is an extinction-level threat. They brought him to Terra under Seal Omega, and if the journey through the warp had revealed how the Imperium hated him, the Sol system revealed something far worse, how much humanity needed him without knowing it. I stood on the Stratageum deck as Holy Terror grew in the void, a world so scarred by industry and devotion that its oceans were scars and its continents mausoleums, and I watched his face as the cradle of our species filled the viewport, expecting awe or reverence, but what I saw instead was grief so raw it made my chest ache, because he did not see a throne world of divine destiny, he saw a planet that had been worked, bled, and buried alive under its own fear. The moment we breached the Mandeville Point, astropathic choirs across Terra began to scream, not in warning but in dissonance, their visions clouded by something they could not categorize, and I learned later that in the Sanctum Imperialis itself, the Emperor's tarot scattered across the floor as if flung by an unseen hand. He felt the throne before we ever set foot on the surface. I know this because he staggered slightly, hand bracing against the bulkhead, eyes wide as if struck by a distant scream carried across millennia, and when I asked him quietly, treasonously what he sensed, he whispered a word that no loyal servant of the Imperium should ever hear spoken aloud. Pain. They escorted him through corridors lined with statues of saints flayed into marble permanence, through halls where the air itself vibrated with prayer and despair, and the custodies flanked him in silence, their presence a threat and a promise both. Yet even they watched him with something like unease, because their gene-forged certainty had no protocol for a man who radiated strength without arrogance. The golden throne chamber was not meant for mortals, yet there we stood, dwarfed by machinery that groaned like a dying god. The Emperor entombed at its heart, a skeletal effigy of infinite will chained to existence by sacrifice measured in souls per day, and when Superman saw him, truly saw him, he fell to one knee without being ordered, not in worship but in instinctive respect for suffering endured. The psychic pressure in that chamber is known to drive inquisitors mad, to make space marines weep, yet he endured it with a trembling steadiness that told me every fiber of his being wanted to do something, to lift the weight crushing the master of mankind, even as he understood, perhaps too late, that some wounds are held in place by the systems built around them. For a moment just a heartbeat stretched into eternity, the Astronomicon flared brighter than it had in centuries, navigational beacons across the Imperium sharpening with sudden clarity, and 1,000 astropaths died screaming in ecstasy and terror as the warp recoiled, and I realized with sickening certainty that the Emperor had noticed him. There was no voice, no miracle proclamation, but Superman gasped as if struck, eyes shining with tears he did not wipe away, and when he spoke, it was barely audible over the roar of machinery. He's still alive. He's trapped. Inquisitor Halbrecht declared immediate heresy, ordering psychic dampeners intensified, screaming that the subject was attempting communion, but it was too late. Something fundamental had shifted. The custodies tightened their grips on Guardian spears, not because Superman attacked, but because he reached out, one hand lifting as if to touch the throne, stopped only by his own restraint, and the agony on his face then was worse than any battle, because he truly knew that, with all his strength, he could not simply rip this god free without destroying the Imperium itself. You built a prison around your savior, he said, voice breaking, and the words echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. Alarms blared as the Astronomicon fluctuated again. Warp storms across Segmentum, solar momentarily thinning, and for a terrifying instant, I felt something I had never felt before, the possibility of dawn. The response was immediate and brutal. Orders cascaded from the Senatorum Imperialis, protocols older than memory activating in unison, and I watched as kill codes were prepared, not because Superman had failed, but because he had succeeded too well. To chaos, he was a beacon of annihilation. To the Imperium, he was a destabilizing variable that threatened the holy equilibrium of eternal war. As they dragged him away, psychic nullfields screaming around him, he did not fight. Instead, he looked back at the throne one last time, whispering a promise not meant for any of us. And I understood then the cruelest truth of all. The Imperium could survive demons, tyrannids, and endless war, but it could not survive being shown that its suffering was not necessary. As the doors sealed and the Astronomicon dimmed back to its usual, sickly glow, I felt the galaxy settle into its familiar agony once more, and somewhere deep within Terra's labyrinthine heart, a man who could lift worlds began to learn the most horrifying lesson this universe has to teach, that sometimes the greatest strength imaginable is still not enough to save a civilization that has mistaken despair for destiny. They imprisoned him beneath Terra, not in a cell but in a concept. A null reliquary excavated from pre-Unity strata where the air tasted of dead empires and the walls were layered with sigils designed to smother miracles. And in the first minute after the seals closed, those 40 to 60 seconds where the mind usually fractures under listened through sanctioned auspex as nothing happened at all, a terrifying absence that felt louder than any scream, because even restrained, even caged by Blackstone and pariah fields, he radiated a steadiness that made the machine spirits hesitate. Days blurred into ritualized cruelty masquerading as inquiry. They bombarded him with catechisms, flooded the chamber with antipsychic harmonics, starved him of light that his cells yearned for like prayer, and still he endured, not with stoic emptiness but with a growing, unbearable sorrow that I could feel through the meters, as if empathy itself were a contaminant leaking through the seals. I was ordered to observe the psychological degradation phase, to catalogue when hope would finally curdle into despair, because the Imperium understands despair. It can be measured, weaponized, controlled. What they did not understand was restraint chosen freely. He spoke to the null wards as if they were people, apologizing when his strength bent to restraint during involuntary muscle spasms, asking the interrogators their names, thanking Medicae for tending wounds he did not need healed. And each act of decency landed like a hammer blow against doctrine. When they unleashed the pariah Cadrezel's blanks whose presence makes even space, Marines retched the air collapsed into nausea and silence, and for the first time I saw him falter, not screaming but shuddering as if submerged in ice. Yet even then he did not strike back. He knelt, fists pressed to the floor, riding out the emptiness with a discipline born not of training but of compassion, and when it passed he whispered, "I'm sorry you were made this way," to the very people whose existence was agony to him. That was the day the first schism began. A junior tech priest rerouted lumen cycles to give him a few extra seconds of simulated sunlight. A guardswoman slipped a child's hand-drawn Aquila into the food tray with a shaking apology. An astropath refused an order to probe his dreams and was quietly reassigned to a penitent battalion. None of these acts were large enough to be called rebellion, but together they formed something more dangerous than treason. They formed precedent. Outside the reliquary, the galaxy reacted as if sensing a fault line. Warp storms surged then stilled. Demonic incursions grew more violent but less subtle, as if chaos were trying to drown out a noise only it could hear. And across a dozen worlds, reports surfaced of inexplicable rescues. A collapsing Hablock, held aloft just long enough for evacuation. A void ship pulled from a star's gravity well by an unseen force, events officially attributed to saints or statistical anomalies. Yet the timestamps aligned too perfectly with moments when the nullfields dipped for maintenance. I confronted Inquisitor Halbrecht once, in a corridor lined with martyr skulls, asking whether it was wise to provoke something that had already demonstrated the capacity to antagonize the warp itself, and he looked at me with pity sharpened into contempt, telling me the Imperium does not fear monsters, it fears alternatives. The breaking point came during the Concordance of Thorns. A High Lord's session convened to decide his final disposition, when a Black Templar crusade vanished in a warp eddy that should not have existed, and astropathic echoes returned not as screams but as confused reports of a corridor of calm cutting through madness. In the reliquary, alarms wailed as the null field spiked, and I watched through the observation slit as he rose, face drawn tight with decision, eyes burning not with anger but resolve, and for the first time he pushed back, not against the walls but against the premise of his captivity, focusing, breathing, aligning himself with the distant star that fed him strength. The lights flickered. Blackstone cracked. The pariah cadre collapsed unconscious as if gently laid down, and in that fragile window of freedom he did not escape. He turned toward Terra above, toward the teeming billions who would never know his name, and he chose them over himself, redirecting the surge outward, stabilizing a dozen warp breaches, shoring up failing void shields, saving fleets he would never see. The effort nearly killed him. He fell to one knee, actual blood darkening the floor, and the nullfield slammed back into place with punitive force. But the damage was done. Across the Imperium, for one impossible hour, routes were clear. Prayers went unanswered by screams, and commanders made decisions without desperation clawing at their thoughts. The High Lords called it a statistical fluke. Chaos called it an insult. And among the people who had watched a man bleed to save strangers who had chained him, something fragile and irreversible took root. I filed my report with hands that would not stop shaking, knowing that I was documenting the opening movements of a war unlike any other, war not for territory or souls, but for the right to believe that suffering was not sacred. And as the reliquary seals cooled and the galaxy's old agonies rushed back in, I understood the final horror of it all. The Imperium had not imprisoned a god or a weapon, but a mirror, and it would shatter itself before allowing humanity to see what it had become.